The boss asks his assistant to pretend to be his fiancée, but when her mother sees her, she bursts into tears. Guadalupe Hernandez has always been a dedicated and hard-working woman. At 28, she was already an executive assistant at the prestigious technology company Tech Futuro, located in the heart of Mexico City. Her boss, the young and charismatic CEO Alejandro Ramirez, was known for his business genius and somewhat turbulent personal life. One typical fall Friday, Guadalupe was organizing Alejandro's schedule when he rushed into her office, looking more anxious than usual. "Guadalupe, I need your help urgently," Alejandro said, running his hands through his dark hair in a nervous gesture. Guadalupe looked at her boss with concern. "Of course, Mr. Ramirez, what can I do for you?" Alejandro hesitated for a moment before continuing. "This is going to sound crazy, but I need you to pretend to be my fiancée for a few days." Guadalupe blinked several times, trying to process what she had just heard. "I'm sorry, what? I know, it's crazy." Alejandro sighed, sitting down in the chair in front of Guadalupe's desk. "My mother is coming to visit me. She lives in Guadalajara, and it's been years since we've seen each other in person. The problem is that she keeps pressuring me to find someone and get married. I lied to her that I was engaged so she would stop bothering me, but now she wants to meet my fiancé." Guadalupe frowned, trying to understand the situation. "And why didn't you tell him the truth?" Alejandro shook his head. "You don't know my mother, Guadalupe. She's intense." However, something in her boss's desperate expression made her hesitate. "Mr. Ramirez, please call me Alejandro. If we're going to pretend we're sweethearts, I think we can forget the formalities," he said with a nervous smile. Guadalupe sighed. "Alejandro, this is crazy. How are we going to convince your mother that we are engaged? We don't know anything about each other's personal lives." "We can create a convincing story," Alejandro argued. "You're smart and I'm good at improvising. I'm sure we can do it. Please, Guadalupe, I'll raise your salary and give you an extra week's vacation." Guadalupe knew she had to refuse. It was unethical. It could complicate her situation at work, and frankly, it was an absurd idea. But something inside her, perhaps curiosity or compassion, made her consider the proposal. "All right," he finally agreed, almost not believing his own words. "I'll do it. But on one condition. As soon as your mother leaves, we immediately return to our normal working relationship." Alejandro's face lit up with relief and gratitude. Of course. Thank you, Guadalupe. You don't know how much this means to me." Over the next few days, Guadalupe and Alejandro worked together to create a compelling story about their relationship. They decided that they had started dating a year ago, after working together on a major project. The marriage proposal supposedly took place during a romantic trip to Cancun 3 months earlier. Guadalupe is surprised to discover that despite the strangeness of the situation, she is having fun creating this fictional story with Alejandro. She had always seen him as her distant and professional boss, but now she was getting to know a more human and vulnerable side of him. The day before Alejandro's mother arrived, they rehearsed their story again in Alejandro's office. "When was our first kiss?" asked Alejandro, testing Guadalupe. "It was after the presentation party for the Azteca project," Guadalupe promptly replied. "You walked me home, and when we were saying goodbye, we couldn't resist the tension that had been building between us for months." Alejandro smiled, impressed. "Very good. And what is my favorite dish?" "Mole poblano," Guadalupe answered without hesitation. "But only the one your mother makes. There is no other comparable." "Excellent," praised Alejandro. "I think we're ready." That night, Guadalupe could barely sleep. She wondered if she was making a big mistake by agreeing to this crazy plan. What if Alejandro's mother discovered the truth? What if it affected her career in some way? The next morning, Guadalupe dressed more carefully than usual. She chose a light blue dress that brought out her eyes and pulled her brown hair up in an elegant bun. When she arrived at Alejandro's apartment in Polanco, her heart skipped a beat. Alejandro opened the door as nervous as she was. "You look beautiful," he told her, and Guadalupe couldn't help but notice a tone of sincerity in his voice that caught her by surprise. "Thank you," she replied, feeling her cheeks flush slightly. "You look very nice yourself." They spent the next hour going over the final details of their story and preparing the apartment for the arrival of Senora Rosario, Alejandro's mother. When the doorbell finally rang, the two exchanged a nervous glance before Alejandro went to open. "Mom!" exclaimed Alejandro, hugging a short lady with grey hair and a warm smile. "My son," replied Mrs. Rosario, hugging him back tightly. When they parted, her eyes immediately turned to Guadalupe, who was standing nervously a few steps behind them. "And that must be Guadalupe," Alejandro added, holding out his hand and gently pulling her close. "My fiancée." Guadalupe smiled, extending her hand to greet Ms. Rosario. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you, Senora Rosario. Alejandro speaks highly of you." To Guadalupe and Alejandro's surprise, Mrs. Rosario's eyes filled with tears. She took Guadalupe's hands between hers and looked at her intently. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Rosario said in a trembling voice, You are exactly as I imagined." Guadalupe shot a puzzled look at Alejandro, who looked equally perplexed. "Thank you," Guadalupe replied hesitantly. "I hope these are good things Alejandro has told you about me." Senora Rosario shook her head, tears now running freely down her face. "No, querida, it's not that. It's just that. Alejandro, don't you see?" Alejandro frowned, clearly confused. "You realize what, Mama?" Mrs. Rosario let go of Guadalupe's hands and opened her purse, pulling out an old yellowed photograph. With trembling hands, she held it out to Alejandro and Guadalupe. In the photo was a young woman smiling at the camera. She had long brown hair, dark eyes, and a radiant smile. The resemblance to Guadalupe was uncanny. Is that Grandma Isabel?" asked Alejandro, his voice barely above a whisper. Senora Rosario nodded, wiping away tears. "Yes, my son. This is my mother. Your grandmother when she was Guadalupe's age. She died before you were born, remember? I always said she was watching over you from above." Guadalupe looked at the photo, then at Mrs. Rosario, and finally at Alejandro, feeling completely lost. She didn't know how to react to this unexpected situation. "The resemblance is incredible," Guadalupe managed to say. Mrs. Rosario smiled through her tears. "It's not just the way you look, my dear, the way you talk, the way you move. It's as if my mother were here again. When Alejandro told me about you, about how you met and fell in love, I felt there was something special. Now I understand it. It was she who led you to each other." Alejandro seemed in shock, alternating his gaze between the photo of his grandmother and Guadalupe. The guilt of lying to his mother seemed to weigh even heavier on his shoulders now. "Mom, You don't have to say anything, my son," Mrs. Rosario interrupted him, taking his hands. "I know you've always been skeptical about these things, but there are things that simply can't be explained. Love is one of them." Guadalupe felt a lump rise in her throat. Mrs. Rosario's genuine emotion, mixed with the guilt she felt for having participated in this farce, was becoming unbearable. "Senora Rosario," Guadalupe began, not knowing exactly what she was going to say, but feeling she had to say something. "Call me Rosario, querida," the senora smiled warmly. "Or mama, prefer. After all, we will soon be family." Rosario's words hit Guadalupe like a punch in the stomach. The lie had gone too far. She looked at Alejandro, silently asking for help, but he seemed as lost as she was. "How about coffee?" finally suggested Alejandro, his voice strangely high-pitched. "Mom, why don't you sit down while Guadalupe and I prepare something?" Rosario gladly agreed, taking a seat on the living room sofa and never taking her eyes off her mother's picture with a nostalgic smile. In the kitchen, Alejandro and Guadalupe exchanged panicked glances. "What are we going to do?" whispered Guadalupe furiously. "This is getting out of hand." Alejandro ran his hands over his face, looking defeated. I know, I had no idea. My God, how could you be so much like my grandmother?" Guadalupe shook her head in frustration. "It doesn't matter anymore, Alejandro. We can't go on with this lie. Your mother is too emotionally involved." Alejandro nodded slowly. "You're right. I'm going to tell her the truth." "You sure?" asked Guadalupe, surprised by Alejandro's sudden change of heart. "And her health?" Alejandro sighed deeply. "I can't keep lying, not after this. My mother deserves the truth, whatever the consequences." Guadalupe felt a surge of respect for Alejandro at that moment. She put a hand on his shoulder in support. Do you want her to be with you when you tell her? Alejandro looked at her gratefully. Please, I don't think I can do it alone. They made coffee in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they returned to the living room, Rosario greeted them with a warm smile. How good it smells, she exclaimed. Guadalupe, my dear, Alejandro tells me you make a special pot coffee. I can't wait to try it. Guadalupe exchanged a quick glance with Alejandro before smiling hesitantly at Rosario. Actually, Señora Rosario, there is something we need to talk to you about. Rosario's smile wavered slightly. What is it? Has something happened? Alejandro sat down next to his mother, taking her hands in his. Mom, I need to tell you something, and I ask you to please listen to me all the way through. Rosario looked from Alexander to Guadalupe, concern evident on her face. You're scaring me. What's going on? Alejandro took a deep breath before he began. Mom, I've made a terrible mistake. I have lied to you. Guadalupe is not my fiancée. She's my assistant at the company. The silence that followed was deafening. Rosario looked at Alejandro, then at Guadalupe, and her expression went from astonishment to confusion and finally to pain. But why? She finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander lowered his head, embarrassed. I was tired of the pressure to get married, to find someone. I lied about my engagement so you would stop worrying. When you told me you were coming to visit, I panicked and asked Guadalupe to pretend to be my fiancée. I'm sorry, Mom. I never meant to hurt you. Rosario released her hands from Alejandro's, silent tears streaming down her face. You lied to me. All this time. Guadalupe felt her heart squeeze as she saw the pain in Rosario's eyes. Señora Rosario, please don't blame Alejandro. I am also to blame for agreeing to this. We never imagined things would end up like this. Rosario stood up abruptly, turning away from Alejandro and Guadalupe. I need a moment, she said, her voice trembling, before quickly heading to the guest room and closing the door. Alejandro and Guadalupe remained seated in silence, the weight of their actions weighing on them. I messed up, Alejandro muttered, covering his face with his hands. Guadalupe hesitated for a moment before placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. You have done well to tell the truth, Alejandro. Your mother needs time to assimilate all this. The next few hours were tense. Rosario remained in her room, refusing to come out or talk to them. Alejandro alternated periods of silent guilt with frustrated attempts to talk to his mother through the closed door. Guadalupe felt like an intruder, witnessing such an intimate and painful moment between mother and son. She thought about leaving several times, but something kept her there. Perhaps a sense of responsibility or the need to see how the situation was resolved. It was already dark when the door to the guest room finally opened. Rosario stepped out, red-eyed and puffy, but with a resigned calmness on her face. Alejandro, she called softly. Alejandro, who was sitting on the couch with his head in his hands, immediately stood up. Mama, Rosario held up a hand, shushing him. I have spent the last few hours thinking, Alejandro, and although I am deeply hurt by your lie, I understand why you did it. Alejandro blinked, surprised. You understand? Rosario nodded slowly. I haven't been the best mother over the years, have I? Pushing you, making you feel inadequate for not finding anyone. I was so focused on what I thought was best for you that I didn't realize the extent to which I was smothering you. Mom, it's not your fault, Alejandro protested. I should have been honest with you from the beginning. Rosario smiled sadly. Maybe it's both of our faults, me for pushing too hard and you for not trusting me enough to be honest. Then she turned to Guadalupe, who was standing awkwardly near the kitchen. Guadalupe, honey, would you join us, please? Guadalupe approached hesitantly, not knowing what to expect. I owe you an apology, too, Rosario said quietly. You have been dragged into this situation, and I have put you in a very uncomfortable position with my assumptions. Guadalupe quickly shook her head. No, please don't apologize. I could have refused to participate in this. It's my fault too. Rosario took Guadalupe's hands between hers and looked into her eyes. You know, even though you are not really my son's fiancée, there is something special about you, Guadalupe. It's not just the resemblance to my mother. It's something else, something I can't explain. Guadalupe felt tears forming in her eyes, touched by Rosario's kindness, even after all she had been through. What happens now? Asked Alejandro, his voice full of uncertainty. Rosario let go of Guadalupe's hands and turned to her son. "Now, honey, we start again, this time with sincerity. I promise not to pressure you with marriage or relationships, and you promise to always be honest with me no matter what. Can we do that?" Alexander nodded, tears in his eyes. "Yes, Mom, I promise." Mother and son embraced. Years of misunderstandings and unspoken expectations finally released in that moment of reconciliation. Guadalupe watched the scene, feeling both an intruder and strangely part of that moment. She silently prepared to leave, feeling that her presence was no longer necessary. "Guadalupe," Rosario's voice stopped her. "You don't have to leave." Guadalupe turned around surprised. I thought you might want some privacy." Rosario smiled, holding out a hand. "You're part of this now, my dear. Besides, I'd really like to meet the real Guadalupe if you don't mind." Alejandro looked at Guadalupe, a silent request in his eyes. Guadalupe hesitated a moment before smiling and taking Rosario's hand. "I would love to," she replied sincerely. The three of them sat down, and for the first time since this whole charade began to talk honestly. Guadalupe talked about her life, her work, her dreams and hopes. Alejandro shared his fears and insecurities, things he had never confessed to his mother before. And Rosario listened, really listened, offering words of comfort and encouragement. As the evening progressed, something unexpected began to happen. The initial tension and awkwardness gave way to laughter and shared stories. Guadalupe discovered that she had much in common with Rosario, from a taste for classic literature to a secret passion for soap operas. Alejandro watched the two women interact, with a strange feeling growing in his chest. He had always seen Guadalupe as his efficient assistant, but now, seeing her laughing and chatting animatedly with his mother, he saw her in a new light. When dawn broke, all three were exhausted, but somehow lighter. The lie that had originally bound them together had become real and precious. "It's late," Rosario said, looking at her watch. "I think it's time for us to go to bed." Alejandro nodded, getting up. "I'll get the guest room ready for you, Mom." "Actually," Rosario said hesitantly, "I was thinking maybe I could stay in a hotel. I don't want to be a bother." Alejandro frowned. "Mom, you're not a bother. Stay, please." Rosario smiled softly. "I know, honey, but I think we all need a little space to process everything that happened today. Besides," she added with a mischievous twinkle in her eye, "I think you and Guadalupe have a lot to talk about." Alejandro and Guadalupe exchanged surprised glances, a slight blush rising to their cheeks. "Mama, it's not," began Alejandro, but Rosario interrupted him with a gesture. "I may be old, my son, but I'm not blind. There is something special between the two of you, something that goes beyond this charade you have created. Perhaps it is time for you to explore it honestly." Guadalupe felt her heart race at Rosario's words. She looked at Alejandro, seeing in him the same mix of confusion and hope. I should go," Guadalupe said, rising abruptly. "It's late." "No," said Alejandro and Rosario at the same time, causing Guadalupe to freeze in place. Alejandro cleared his throat, looking nervous. "It's too late for you to drive. Why don't you stay? I can sleep on the couch." Guadalupe hesitated, torn between the desire to escape this confusing situation and the inexplicable desire to stay. Rosario smiled and picked up her bag. "It's settled then. I'll go to the hotel and you two talk. Tomorrow we'll meet for breakfast, what do you say?" Before Alejandro or Guadalupe could protest, Rosario was already saying goodbye and walking out the door, leaving them alone in the suddenly silent apartment. Alejandro and Guadalupe stood still, looking at each other, the air between them charged with unresolved tension. "So," Alejandro began, running his hand through his hair nervously. "So," Guadalupe repeated, a small smile on her lips. Suddenly, they both burst out laughing, the absurd situation they were in hitting them full on. "I can't believe what happened," said Guadalupe between laughs. Alejandro shook his head, still laughing. "If someone told me that story, I'd say it was the script of a soap opera." When the laughter finally subsided, there was a comfortable silence between them. Alejandro took a hesitant step toward Guadalupe. "Guadalupe, I wanted to thank you for everything. Not just for agreeing to this madness, but for how you handled the whole situation. You've been amazing." Guadalupe felt her cheeks light up at the compliment. "No need to thank me, Alejandro. I'm glad I could help." Alejandro looked at her intently, as if seeing her for the first time. "You know, maybe my mother is right." Guadalupe's heart skipped a beat. "About what?" Alejandro took another step toward her, narrowing the distance that separated them. "About there being something special between us, something that goes beyond the professional." Guadalupe felt her breath quicken. She knew she should pull back, keep it professional, but something inside her kept her from turning away. "Alejandro, Shh," he whispered, lifting a hand to gently touch her cheek. "I know this is complicated, that there are 1,000 reasons why we shouldn't even consider it. But after today, after seeing you with my mother, seeing how you've handled everything, I can't ignore what I feel." Guadalupe closed her eyes, letting herself be carried away by the sensation of his touch on her face. When she opened them again, she saw Alejandro looking at her with a mixture of desire and vulnerability that made her heart melt. "And what do you feel?" she asked him softly. In response, Alejandro leaned toward her and kissed her. It was a soft, hesitant kiss, so different from the staged passion they had invented in their fictional story. But it was real, and it made Guadalupe feel as if her whole body was electrified. When they broke apart, they both gasped and looked at each other with a mixture of surprise and desire. "Wow," Guadalupe whispered. Alejandro smiled, resting his forehead on hers. "Yeah, wow." For a moment they stood like that, taking in the reality of what had just happened. Then, as if awakening from a dream, they both took a step back. "This is complicated," Guadalupe said, running a hand through her hair. Alejandro nodded, equal parts confused and elated. "I know. There are so many things to consider. Our work, what people will think." "Your mother," Guadalupe added with a small smile. Alejandro laughed softly. "Yes, my mother, although I think she would approve." Guadalupe bit her lip thoughtfully. "What do we do now?" Alejandro took her hands, looking serious but hopeful. "I think we'll do what my mother suggested. We'll talk. No detours, no pretense, no pressure. Just the two of us, discovering what's between us." Guadalupe felt a surge of relief and excitement course through her body. "I'd like that," she said softly. Alejandro smiled and guided her to the couch. They sat down, still holding hands, and began to talk. They talked about their fears, their hopes, how they felt about each other and their work. They talked about the challenges they would face if they decided to explore a relationship and how they would deal with them. Hours passed unnoticed. Night gave way to dawn. As the first rays of sunshine began to enter through the window, Guadalupe and Alejandro were exhausted, but with a new clarity and a new purpose. "I think we should take things slow," Alejandro said, stroking Guadalupe's hand with his thumb. "Give things time to adjust at work so we can be sure this is what we really want." Guadalupe nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and anticipation. "I agree. I don't want to jeopardize our friendship or our professional relationship over something rash." Alejandro smiled, leaning down to deposit a soft kiss on Guadalupe's forehead. "But I don't want to lose this either," he whispered. "Neither do I," Guadalupe replied, feeling her heart widen with new hope. The ringing of Alejandro's phone brought them back to reality. It was a message from Rosario, reminding them about breakfast. "I think it's time to face the world," Alejandro said with a nervous smile. Guadalupe took a deep breath, bracing herself for what was coming next. "Together?" she asked, holding out her hand. Alejandro took it and interlaced their fingers. "Together," he confirmed. As they prepared to leave to meet Rosario, Guadalupe reflected on how unpredictable life could be. What had started out as an elaborate lie had turned into something real and precious. She didn't know exactly what the future held for her and Alejandro, but for the first time in a long time, she was eager to find out. When they arrived at the taqueria where Rosario was waiting for them, Guadalupe felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. She looked at Alejandro, who gave her an encouraging smile before opening the door. Rosario saw them immediately, and her face lit up with an accomplice smile. "Good morning, darlings," she exclaimed, rising to greet them. "Good morning, Mum," Alejandro replied, giving her a kiss on the cheek. "Buenos dias, Señora Rosario," Guadalupe said, still a little hesitant about how to address Alejandro's mother after all that had happened. Rosario took Guadalupe's hands between hers, looking lovingly into her eyes. "Guadalupe, honey, I think after all we've been through, you can just call me Rosario." Guadalupe felt a lump in her throat, touched by Rosario's acceptance. "Thank you, Rosario." The three of them sat down, a momentary silence hovering over the table as they looked at the menus, though it was obvious that none of them were really concentrating on the food. Finally, Rosario broke the silence. "So," she said, looking from Alejandro to Guadalupe with an amused twinkle in her eye, "I guess you two had an interesting talk last night." Alejandro choked on the coffee he was drinking, while Guadalupe felt her cheeks turn red. "Mama," Alejandro warned, shooting a meaningful glance at Rosario. Rosario laughed softly. "Don't worry, I'm not going to pry. I just want to know they're okay." Guadalupe and Alejandro exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, it was Guadalupe who answered, "We are fine, Rosario. In fact, we are more than fine. Last night, we talked a lot." Alejandro took Guadalupe's hand from under the table, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We've decided there's something between us worth exploring," he added, "but we're going to go slowly, respecting our professional and personal boundaries." Rosario's face lit up with a beaming smile. "Oh, my dears, this is wonderful. I knew there was something special between you from the moment I saw you together." Guadalupe couldn't help but smile at Rosario's enthusiasm. "We still have a lot to work out," she said, trying to keep her expectations realistic. "But we're willing to try." Rosario nodded, her face more serious. "Life is too short not to take risks for love, my dears. Believe me, I know that better than anyone." There was a moment of thoughtful silence, each of them absorbing the weight of Rosario's words. Then, as if deciding to lighten the mood, Rosario cheerfully clapped her hands. "Well, I think that calls for a celebration. What do you say we order some chilaquiles and some good tacos al pastor?" "Mom, it's 9 a.m., protested Alejandro, but he couldn't help but smile. "Well, it's never too early to celebrate love," Rosario replied with a wink. As the waiter brought the food and they began to enjoy the typical Mexican breakfast, Guadalupe felt a surge of gratitude and happiness wash over her. Looking at Alejandro and Rosario, she realized that somehow, amidst all the madness of pretense and revelations, she had not only found a possible love but also a family. Rosario lifted her coffee cup. "A toast," she said, "to honesty, love, and new beginnings." "To honesty, love, and new beginnings," Alejandro and Guadalupe repeated in unison as their cups clinked softly. As they savored their café de olla, Guadalupe reflected on how amazing life could be. What had started out as an elaborate lie had turned into an opportunity for true love. She didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but looking at Alejandro, seeing the affection and hope in his eyes, she knew she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. In the months that followed, Guadalupe and Alejandro carefully navigated the challenges of a budding relationship while maintaining their professional dynamic. It was not easy. There were moments of doubt, insecurity, and even some misunderstandings. But with each obstacle overcome, their bond grew stronger. At work, they maintained a strictly professional demeanor, although their colleagues couldn't help but notice the exchange of discreet glances and smiles. Finally, they decided to inform the Human Resources Department about their relationship, to avoid any conflict of interest. Rosario, true to her promise, did not interfere directly in their relationship, but was always nearby with words of encouragement and wise counsel. She became a constant presence in Guadalupe's life, filling a void that Guadalupe did not even know existed. A year after that fateful night when it all began, Alejandro and Guadalupe were back in her Polanco apartment, preparing for a special dinner. "Do you think she'll like it?" asked Alejandro nervously, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. Guadalupe smiled and reached over to fix his tie. "Alejandro, your mother will love it. Relax." Alejandro took a deep breath and leaned over to give Guadalupe a soft kiss. "Thank you for being here with me. I don't know what I would do without you." "So you'd probably still be making up fictional girlfriends," Guadalupe joked, making Alejandro laugh. The doorbell interrupted them. Alejandro went to open it, discovering a beaming Rosario on the other side of the door. "Darlings?" she exclaimed, hugging Alejandro and then Guadalupe. "What a wonderful surprise. a special dinner just for the three of us." Guadalupe and Alejandro exchanged a knowing glance. There was more to this dinner than Rosario thought. As they ate and chatted animatedly, Guadalupe couldn't help but think about how her life had changed in the last year. She looked at Alejandro and felt her heart fill with love and gratitude. After dessert, Alejandro cleared his throat nervously, catching Rosario and Guadalupe's attention. "Mama," he began, his voice slightly shaky. "A year ago, I made the mistake of lying to you about having a fiancé. It was a foolish and thoughtless decision, but ironically it was that lie that led me to the woman I really love." He turned to Guadalupe, taking her hands in his. "Guadalupe, you came into my life unexpectedly, but now I can't imagine my life without you. You make me want to be a better person every day." Guadalupe felt tears well up in her eyes as Alejandro continued. "I know we started with a lie, but I want to spend the rest of my life building a truth with you. Guadalupe Hernandez, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife for real this time?" Alejandro pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, revealing a delicate and elegant ring. Guadalupe felt her heart race. She looked at the ring, at Alejandro's hopeful face, and finally at Rosario, who was watching the scene with tears in her eyes and a radiant smile. In that moment, Guadalupe saw her whole life unfold before her. She saw the challenges they would face, the joys they would share, the family they would build together. And she knew with a certainty that came from the depths of her soul what his answer was. "Yes," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "Yes, Alejandro, I agree to marry you." Alejandro slipped the ring on her finger with trembling hands before kissing her passionately. Rosario clapped her hands enthusiastically, tears of happiness streaming down her face. "Oh, my darlings," exclaimed Rosario, hugging them both. "I knew it. I always knew you were made for each other." As they celebrated with more pot coffee and laughter, Guadalupe reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them here. What had started out as an elaborate lie had turned into the most beautiful truth of her life. Looking at Alejandro and Rosario, her new family, Guadalupe knew that whatever the future held for them, they would face it together. With love, honesty, and perhaps a little magic of fate, they would write their own love story, page by page. And so, in an apartment in Polanco, under the loving gaze of a mother, and in the arms of the man she loved, Guadalupe realized that sometimes the most unlikely lies can lead to the deepest truths. Her heart overflowed with gratitude for every moment, every challenge, and every twist and turn that had brought them there. As the evening progressed and plans for the future began to take shape amid laughter and shared dreams, Guadalupe knew that this was just the first page of a new chapter in their lives. A chapter full of love, honesty, and above all, the certainty that the most unexpected paths often lead to the most wonderful destinations. And so, with the ring shining on her finger and love shining in her eyes, Guadalupe embraced her future, grateful for every twist and turn that had led her to this perfect moment.